welcome you all to the next session on the program, which is In Conversation. And I would like to call on stage the interviewer, Mari Gordon, one of our finest PhD students here at IRDR. She will do the interview of our speaker, Dr. Emily Wilkinson. Mari will give an elaborated introduction for Emily, but I would like to first ask Mari to come on stage, and then Mari to continue the In Conversation with Emily. Yeah.
So, hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this In Conversation. I know that I'm particularly excited and we're all really honoured that we have Emily here with us today from Overseas Development Initiative. I would just sort of like to run through a little bit of the format of how we're planning to run this session, and then I'll invite Emily up onto the stage. So we'll be addressing two main topics. So in the first instance, small island developing states, also known as SIDS. And then in the second instance, looking at the 26th conference of the parties at Glasgow in 2021, also known as COP26. We will take some sort of burning questions in between, so after the first topic and then the second topic, and then wrap it up with a discussion. So for a quick introduction, Dr. Emily Wilkinson has 25 years experience as a researcher, analyst, journalist, lecturer, and advisor to government, so very well accomplished. Emily is the director of a very newly established ODI Resilient and Sustainable Island Initiative, known as RESI, and is a senior research fellow in the ODI Global Risk and Resilience Program, which is leading a team working on advancing resilient ambition and financing. She also holds a PhD in human geography here from University College London, a master's in local and regional development from the Erasmus University Rotterdam, and a bachelor's in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of York. So on that note, I would like to invite Emily up to join me for this In Conversation. Hi. So again, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I think it would be really nice before we take a deep dive into these two very topical discussions, if you would mind starting a bit with describing to people your background, sort of what drew you to these fields, as well as sort of your motivation to continue in this research.
Thanks very much, Mari. Thanks for the kind introduction, and to UCL and IRDR for inviting me to take part in this In Conversation, to have an informal discussion today. I was thinking a little bit in advance of this In Conversation about how I did get to this, to where I am today, and to working on what I'm working on. And I think a really kind of critical point for me, I was working as a researcher in Mexico City, and had been asked to sort of lead a group of renowned experts, really, on doing an evaluation of the Natural Disaster Fund. Then, this was back in 2004, and there'd been two major hurricanes that year, I think, in different parts of Mexico. And so we were evaluating the performance of the fund, which involved doing some surveys and key informant interviews with populations that had been affected, but to also find out how they'd sort of received the support and their kind of assessment of the different kinds of support and assistance they'd received. And it was fascinating. We got very, very different responses. In one part of the country, in the north of Mexico, people were very upset with the mechanism and how it had worked, and gave very sort of low marks, if you like, to the federal government for its assistance. And in the southeast of Mexico, which is a region that really experiences hurricanes, tropical cyclones quite, probably more frequently than the north, they were a lot more positive about the support that they'd received. And as we kind of dug into this a little bit more, and there were similar kind of events, similar strengths, similar kind of impacts, as we dug into it a bit more, it turned out that in these municipalities in the southeast of Mexico, they had had a lot more sort of pre-disaster preparedness, experience, training, developing plans. They weren't like, by their own admission, super well prepared, but just having had those conversations, just having engaged in those topics before the event happened and then before they were receiving this support meant that they had were more kind of bought into the process, and they were more supportive of it and benefited more from it, I guess. So that was really interesting. Then I started my PhD because I wanted to look at this in more detail, and again, but now looking even more at sort of different responses in different municipalities very close to each other in the southeast of Mexico. And again, very different experiences. And what it came down to, really, to kind of cut a long story short, if I may, of my PhD, which took 4 years to do,
we know the struggle.
was that it's a lot about the local politics. They had very different kinds of leadership in these municipalities. They had different relations with the state government and the federal government, different political parties. They were able to access resources in different ways. And so the politics of it, or the political economy of it, really was absolutely critical to how seriously they were taking the issue, how well prepared they were, and how kind of joined up and effective the response was. So that's kind of where it all started, really. And I guess since then I've been working a lot on the political economy of disaster risk, trying to unpack and understand why people and buildings, critical infrastructure, governments even, are located in highly hazardous places. And I think in the previous panel that came up as well. Like, they really, it's not. It doesn't seem to be rational. But there are lots and lots of kind of complex reasons why, historical reasons why particular urban settlements are located where they are. They've developed in certain ways. So that's kind of my passion, what I'm really interested in.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your story of how you sort of were sparked with your research. And if I'm correct, you are very much taking this focus and applying it sort of in a small island developing states and looking at it from a sustainable development initiative. Could you maybe expand a bit on how that's going, and sort of probably also frameworks that you're using? I know vulnerability and resilience are very big key buzzwords that are used in these discourses. So if you could talk about how that's being applied in those settings.
Sure. So I've sort of, increasingly my work has been more focused on small island developing states, which I think embody a lot of the issues I was just mentioning in terms of the very hazardous geographies, the situation that they're in. And so looking at that, and I think my feeling was, having engaged in different research projects and with different researchers, that people were often taking small islands as kind of case studies. So having a big research idea and then thinking, well, which small island can I apply this in? Where can I do my research? When actually there are lots of kind of common issues and problems that small island developing states face in relation to climate change, but also loss of biodiversity, environmental degradation, and in fact, much more broadly, the kind of economic development model, which many have adopted, this kind of tourism-based, export-led model of economic development, which, for some, they've done really well. Hence, often the way people talk about small island developing states as being resilient is a sort of reflection of the fact that many of them are higher middle income countries, some of them high income countries, that they have done well economically in terms of kind of per capita GDP. But that's really problematic because, of course, every time there is a shock of some sort, and that could be a hazard event, but it could also be a price shock. It could also be COVID and the impacts that it's had on small island tourism and the amount of people on which these economies depend. So that's a really problematic term to be using kind of across the board in the way we talk about small islands. Similarly, vulnerability is a really problematic term. They're all vulnerable. They're all because of their location, because of their topography, because of their history, they're all, you know, going to be incredibly vulnerable. Of course, there are things that they can do about their situation, which and you know, there are differences across the islands as well. But I suppose my point is, and why we initiated this new resilient and sustainable islands kind of global network, is that we wanted to look at these issues kind of across small island developing states, across regions, look at similarities and comparisons between islands in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, and work on this more at an international level as well. There's plenty of kind of good research getting down to the grounds, working with communities and understanding issues individually on different islands. But what we wanted to do is sort of take a group of experts who have a lot of this kind of collective knowledge and see how we could use that to inform international processes. So to say a little bit more about RESI, basically we're trying to sort of target some of the big kind of institutions and decisions and events that are happening to see where the particular issues that islands face can be kind of inserted into those discussions, because they haven't always been. You know, the category of SIDS is a category in the UN climate change negotiations, but it's not in terms of development assistance. There's only really a category of low-income countries or not, and that's problematic for the reasons that I've just said. So we want to look at how we can take the evidence and all this kind of great work that academics are doing, and try and use that to influence some of these kind of international processes, like around eligibility for concessional finance, which currently many small island developing states, you know, are not eligible because of their high levels of GDP.
Yeah, thank you. I think for myself, there are a couple of points, well, lots of points there that I would love to pick up on, but kind of two that I will hone in on. And one is really kind of, I've been, in my first year PhD, been going to quite a few conferences in the past couple months or so, and a lot of the reoccurring theme is about sort of this need to collaborate and for partnerships and to share, you know, good practice, lessons learned, and sort of, as you're saying, bring that up onto an international platform, and trying to have frameworks which also reflect local practices and really what is happening on the ground. So I guess moving on from that, and also, sorry, your second point about talking about this vulnerability, resilience, and the language that's being used, the question that I wanted to ask you was the work that you're doing with Dominica, which is aiming to be the first climate resilient country in the world, if I frame that correctly. So if you could maybe talk about how resilience is being understood here and what they are working on in particular in this country to achieve that aim.
Thanks. Yeah. So with my sort of other hat, I work for the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, which was set up after Hurricane Maria in 2017, which badly affected the island. There have been other hurricanes and tropical storms in the past that have also had important impacts on the economy and on communities and on the environment. But this one was kind of, I think, sort of was symbolic and used in that way by the Prime Minister. So he made this kind of big statement at the UN in the days after Maria had struck, calling on the international community to assist in the recovery, in building back better, to really help Dominica to recover from this really extreme, really impactful event, but also signalling that the strength of the event was related to climate change, and they're going to experience more similar events in the future. So it's a political statement, and it was very well pitched and very well timed, and really to sort of capture the imaginations of UN delegates. And I encourage you to look at it. So it's available online because it's a very powerful speech. But I mean, I think, rather than maybe sort of focusing on whether, in fact, the event was particularly severe because of climate change, or whether, or how likely a similar event is to happen again. I think the more important message here is that was almost back to his own country and citizens and government, really, saying, we do need to take these events seriously, and we do need to, rethink the way that we're building, the way that we're developing the kind of economic model. How are we going to continue to develop and sustain our development gains as a country in the future with all of these challenges? And of course, at the time, COVID and pandemics were not even, in anybody's minds. So he makes this big statement. They do get some support, absolutely nothing like the level that was actually committed at that conference. But the UK government included came in to support a new climate resilience agency, which is the one that I'm seconded to work with part-time. And that agency has been kind of quite critical in pushing forward this agenda. So we are now 5 years later, and it's still very much on the top of the agenda of all kind of ministries in Dominica. We've been working with the ministries to try and kind of mainstream or integrate resilience into their strategic plans. So thinking about every single kind of objective and project and everything that they're working on, how it can help to achieve the targets which Dominica has set out for itself, which I think is another achievement as well. So there's this climate resilience and recovery plan to 2030, which has 20 targets in it, things you can measure, things you'll be able to say in 2030, has Dominica achieved these targets or not? And we're currently in the process of setting up a monitoring and evaluation system to actually look at whether those outcomes have been achieved. I don't see many other countries, and including the UK, I might say, but we can touch on this in discussions, being that kind of open about what is desirable, what we want to achieve. Partly because it would be very, very difficult to do so. And I will say, perhaps not as a representative of Creed, but they're quite likely not to achieve those targets. But it's the ambition, it's setting them forward, and from there, then everything the kind of ministries do, bringing in the private sector, lots of community consultation, and kind of awareness around this vision is making people, I think, take it more seriously. But come back to me in 10 years' time, and we'll see if it's still on the agenda. And hopefully it will be, whether or not there are kind of extreme weather events in the meantime.
Yeah, thank you. I find it really interesting how you spoke about a disaster that occurred and then calling sort of on the international community humanitarian aid response development, and then moving that in towards sort of how it's been implemented in a country, setting these targets, as you're saying. They might not be fulfilled, but they're going to be that much closer to fulfilling them than by having a target than not. And to maybe slightly change the direction of conversation to a recent tweet that you retweeted from the Climate Ambition to Support Alliance, which here, I quote, says, we hear from scientists, participants in small island developing states and least developed countries that hashtag loss and damage is reality, hashtag it means loss of human dignity and well-being, hashtag climate vulnerable country governments are principally using their own resources to address losses. So this, I know, touches on quite a broad area and something that we would like to move to maybe more specifically when speaking about COP. But in this tweet it mentioned sort of the governments of having to rely on their own resources, and I was wondering maybe if you can share why this tweet you retweeted from your own account, as well as sort of why is that a concern, and is it based on the example of Dominica that you just shared before about how they're driving their own initiatives?
So the Climate Ambition Support Alliance works with least developed countries and small island developing states. And for those sets of countries, I'll talk maybe more specifically about small island developing states. There are severe limitations on what they can do with their own resources. They have very, very high levels of debt, external debt, these countries, in part due to having to pay for responses to disasters in the past. So they have really limited kind of fiscal space. The resources they can actually kind of put to use to to respond to future events, to make the kind of investments that are needed to become more resilient, to strengthen infrastructure and so on, is really, really limited. That's one thing. So they're in a tricky situation anyway when it comes to it. It's great to be very enthusiastic about how small islands need to become more resilient, need to adapt to climate change, but like with what resources are they going to do it? Because they have very limited resources, who ends up paying, who absorbs most of the impacts of these shocks? Well, of course, it's individuals, it's, communities. So that's really the bottom line. If the government hasn't got enough resources to provide safety nets and to kind of support people, then of course it's people that bear the brunt of the impacts. And then it's also problematic, I think, from a kind of climate justice perspective as well, because these countries are not responsible for climate change. You'll have heard that sort of mantra before, but it's absolutely spot on. Like they really aren't, and so they're doing their bit, if you like. And Barbados is committed, I think, to having 100% electric vehicles in 5 years' time.
Yeah. And what's really interesting also is so many of these countries have actually met their carbon and their climate targets already. Yeah. They are far ahead of other countries.
Right, and it's
because of lifestyle choices.
Yeah, it's easier for them to do it in the sense that they're not kind of fully industrialized, and they haven't kind of built in all of this these kind of CO2 like generating industries into part of their economy. So it's easier for them to do that. But yeah, I think the bottom line is they're not responsible for climate change. And in a sense, and this is something that I look at in a paper I wrote with some other colleagues on trajectories of risk in Dominica, in a sense they're not responsible for some of the vulnerabilities either. There are reasons why people are living in the place. Dominica is a very mountainous island. There's very little in the way of kind of farmable land and safe land to build on, and where there is that's but land that was like traditionally used in the big kind of sugar plantations during the colonial period, and is still owned, much of it, by families that don't even live in Dominica. So there is, without getting into that in a lot of depth, there is a historical and colonial kind of legacy which helps to explain to some extent why people are located in particularly vulnerable situations, why the road infrastructure is not as you would kind of set it up and build it today. It's all around the coast, and continually gets affected by storm surge and flooding. Like there's lots of characteristics which would appear to be kind of choices and decisions, which you have to look into the kind of history of why they are the case. That helps explain why these small islands are particularly affected by extreme weather events.
Yeah, thank you. I'd maybe suggest that we take a couple burning questions, if there are any, on this topic in time. Or is there anything else you would like to add at this stage? Yeah?
So it's very interesting what you say about Dominica becoming the first country in the sense to go to this level. Why do you think particularly Dominica, of all these sort of Caribbean islands, is going down this route so quickly?
I mean, I think it was partly due to I think the sort of the tenacity of the Prime Minister making that statement. I think he probably made the statement, without having a plan behind it of how that was going to happen. But I think once you kind of have got up and said that, it's sort of the momentum built behind it really, which is quite interesting, because I would say the statement came before the political will, in a sense. The political will came kind of afterwards, and has been very much kind of supported and assisted by having an agency that's dedicated to supporting government and making this happen. I mean, I think they also realised, and of course there were other Caribbean countries affected by the same hurricane, and another one that year, and I think all of them have realised that they need to do something very different. So other Caribbean countries are going through similar processes, but I think maybe they haven't. It's not quite so high profile, and they're being a little bit more cautious about making those kind of very bold statements, like we're going to become the first climate resilient nation in the world. Other countries will are going about it in a different way. They want to do much more careful vulnerability assessments and downscale kind of climate projections first, so that they can develop longer term plans, adaptation plans. They're being a bit more cautious about their sort of metrics and their targets because, of course, you only really know how much adaptation is needed depending on whether the temperature goal is met or not. So these things are all interrelated, and so they don't want to make those kinds of commitments and then find that they are not able to meet them. And the Prime Minister of Dominica has been in power for a very long time and has a very solid support base. So I think there's some sort of political reasons as well why that was possible, and he was able to say that and then kind of bring the whole government and country on board with it, that in other political situations wouldn't be possible.
Thank you. Yes, that also, I think, ties in quite nicely, sort of moving towards loss and damage and sort of politics that are involved in that, as well as climate justice. So again, there was a recent quote from you saying that small island states face an existential threat from climate change or tragedy, to which the phrase loss and damage does not do justice, nor does the Glasgow Climate Pact offer much justice on loss and damage. So could you maybe tell your audience a bit more about this and sort of, I know we started touching upon some of those reasons before, but maybe expand, take the time to expand on them here.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So I was at COP26 last year and actually went with the Dominica delegation and was sat in some of these negotiations. There's lots of different tracks going on at the same time. So for a small island, it's really difficult to kind of cover everything, and there's another kind of inherent disadvantage, if you like, compared with kind of larger states that can send big delegations and be in every negotiating room, right? But it was a great experience to be there and see how the negotiations kind of unfold. And there was a very kind of strong demand from small island developing states, through the kind of first week of COP. And more broadly, I would say the G77 and plus China group, which is a much bigger group of kind of developing countries, for a loss and damage finance facility. And so they were kind of developing some wording around that and what that would look like. And these discussions all kind of happening in the corridors and in the kind of planning meetings at the beginning of the day before the negotiations. So that was kind of a strong kind of theme and a push throughout the first week. Then by the time we got into the second week and sort of halfway through, it became very clear that was not going to go anywhere. But it wasn't really until right at the last minute, kind of at the end of these loss and damage negotiations, that I think basically the US, the EU, the UK was a little bit more ambivalent, stopped it. And ultimately the wording that sort of came out was around a Glasgow dialogue, so a discussion that would start this year, that would continue for 2 years, in which there could be, it's an opportunity to have further discussions, more information, think about what kind of finance might be appropriate to support. So the wording is to avert, minimise and address loss and damage, and those are quite different things, and that's part of the kind of issue and problem with the loss and damage sort of space. But yeah, so that was a very unsatisfactory outcome, let's say, for developing countries to start a dialogue about something which they feel very strongly is needed, and it's been kept off the agenda for so long that they were really hoping at COP26 that they were going to get some much more kind of movement and agreement about some sort of financing facility. So that's what's being discussed now through the Glasgow dialogue. There's also something called the Santiago Network. You might hear more about this afternoon's panel. But that was also a bit disappointing. I mean, that was established at the previous COP, but it's a bit disappointing. It's going to offer technical assistance to countries to help them access finance to pay for technical assistance to deal with loss and damage. You can see, so I think one of the negotiators referred to it as a Russian doll. You know, you just kind of, it's got like layers and layers and sort of nothing underneath. So yeah, unsatisfactory outcomes basically from COP26 on loss and damage.
Yeah, that's very strongly echoing what was mentioned yesterday at the UCL IRDR Humanitarian Summit, where we had some researchers and speakers from Bangladesh who were there, really talking about how it's sort of these rephrasing of, you know, making it a dialogue that's going to occur for 3 years, when actually was a demand that it sort of be established then and there. And also this whole question around financing that you're speaking of, about how, what does it actually mean? Is it actual finance? Is it making it to the people who are impacted, or what is it financing? There's a huge area that we could probably speak about for hours and tap into, but it also sort of nicely ties in with a quote that I'd again like to read from a reflection piece that you co-authored about COP26 with the title "Moving Past the Blame Game to Keep 1.5 Aligned, Reflections on the Glasgow Climate Pact." So in the report it states that the delegates from developing countries commended wealthy countries' failure to provide an annual $100 billion for climate action pledged back in 2009, so quite a while ago now. Within the conference itself, the most vulnerable countries were furious at the rich countries' unwillingness to pay for loss and damage caused by climate change, whereas middle-income countries accused rich countries of carbon colonialism. Sort of what, we have maybe your opinion on sort of what your take is about this call for wealthy nations paying for loss and damage, as well as type of frameworks and channels that exist today and are being discussed about for future, and what do you sort of hope to see happen in future based on that?
Yeah, so this is like highly contentious and contested idea that there should be like additional finance made available to countries suffering the impacts of climate change most severely, in addition to the finance which has been committed and the target which has been set for climate finance, which is basically for mitigation and adaptation. And that there's a new finance goal now being negotiated, so hopefully that will be more in the future. There'll be a bigger target, but I think the idea is that that target should still only be sort of for finance, which is to help countries to adapt to climate change and to kind of invest in mitigation. Arguably, like, mitigation is not really the priority, and a bigger proportion of that climate finance goal should be sort of tagged or set aside for support and adaptation. I think a lot of kind of mitigation activities could be funded through kind of regular loans, right? And there isn't such a great need for grant funding or grant finance or highly concessional finance. But the idea is that that additional finance for loss and damage should be something separate. It's additional to that. It shouldn't be just sort of subsumed in the. But particularly for the addressing part of loss and damage, so not for the averting and minimizing bit, which can be, if you think about, depending on how these terms are actually defined and used, that's really adaptation and DRR. The addressing loss and damage bit is what happens when, these impacts, they do happen. You can't mitigate, you can't reduce all risks, so is that then something that should be in the form of compensation that people are then entitled to? That gets you into a whole area around kind of international law. And obviously developed countries, including the UK, are keen to kind of avoid that, to keep that out of the negotiations. But there's stronger and stronger demands now for some sort of significant amount of finance that could be made available, that would also be kind of channeled down to communities as well. It wouldn't necessarily be something that is kind of state to state, or the government has control over, which I think is right. So people have been talking about, for example, some kind of trust fund in perpetuity for young people, in particularly vulnerable countries or communities, who will be the ones who experience the brunt of the impacts of climate change. So that's very different than other climate finance mechanisms that we have at the moment.
Yeah, my impression, but not an expert on, like you are on this subject, is very much so things like the Green Climate Fund are sort of more looking at working with governments and sort of top down. So it's really interesting to hear about how there are new avenues being explored using sort of trust funds and focusing on the youth who will be living through a lot of this. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. We have a couple minutes if there are any questions that people would like to ask Emily at this stage before we do a final wrap up. Yeah. And maybe if there's another one, we might do the two or a couple questions at once in the interest of time.
Hello.
Very good.
I'm Josh Anthony, a second year PhD student at RDR. I just wondered how you think that the Dominican government's ambition to become the first climate resilient country in the world, how that differs from other national pledges and claims.
Other national pledges on climate change, did you say? Sorry.
Other pledges made by countries to deal with climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Most of the pledges are around like mitigation targets or becoming carbon neutral, and which is kind of easier, not easy, but it's easier to measure, and it's easier to kind of account for. How much CO2 is being produced through different parts of economic activity. I think the difference with Dominica, and I might be wrong, there may be other countries that have also set kind of climate resilience or adaptation targets, is that it's setting kind of outcome level targets. Like, so one of the targets, for example, in the plan is that communities will be able to be self-sufficient for 15 days after an extreme weather event, right? Obviously, it depends on the intensity and the circumstances of the event, how realistic that is. But as a target, it's quite bold, to actually say we want to make sure that communities will have enough, food, water, energy, first aid equipment, shelters in a good enough condition to be able to house people for that length of time. Could be a lot of people. So doing all that needs to be done to ensure that happens, I think is quite unique. It may be that other countries are doing similar kind of things, but haven't set that kind of quantifiable goal. And then, I think so some of these things you can't measure until an event happens. So another thing that we've been doing is to set kind of more intermediate targets and indicators in the meantime. So things like, measuring what is the amount of kind of food supplies and water that a community would need, and measuring whether or not all communities have that at the start of hurricane season, for example. That's just one of the targets. Some of the other ones are more around sort of sustained economic growth levels. So then, how to ensure that is actually very complex. There's a lot of things you need to look at in terms of diversification of the economy. So if one particular sector gets very badly affected, there's still kind of productivity in another. Yeah. So I think that's where I think it's a little bit different. It's sort of setting these outcome level targets for resilience, which is something that people can argue indefinitely about how to measure it and what it is. But just sort of committing to some, I think, is quite important, and getting over that kind of reluctance to commit to targets for things that are quite difficult to measure.
A couple of questions. So first, do you have as a target preparedness of individuals and households? so that if extreme weather or climate event happens, that everybody knows exactly what to do and they have a stock of food and water. And second question, do you also think about how to bring private money and the investments, because that's the adaptation and resilience measures are not something that private money will flow into, but we certainly need to scale up the investments in this sector as well, and the government money is not enough.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So
You also introduce yourself, so now.
Yeah, Dilara Salahova, I'm from the European Central Bank.
Thanks. So I think if I understand, the first question is about should there be targets around preparedness for community? Yeah. No, I think that's really important. Like, again, it's very difficult to kind of measure, but they are proposing, for example, to do a sample survey of the population again at the start of hurricane season to assess what extent people are understand what the preparedness measures are that they need to take. So we're going to do this survey annually to see kind of what the level of preparedness is. Obviously, you can't interview everybody, but to take a kind of random sample of the population and ask them very specific questions about what they've done to prepare. Are they aware of like where the shelter is? Are they aware of like who needs to go? Are they do they understand the early warning system and the alert levels and so on? So there's this kind of series of questions that they'll be asked. So that's one way of it's one sort of indicator or way of assessing how prepared people are in terms of what they're actually doing to help to be better prepared. I think it's very similar to what other countries are doing. So in terms of like developing community preparedness plans, doing a kind of local mapping of hazards affecting the community. There was a national assessment actually of vulnerability, sort of physical vulnerability of communities to identify which ones are most likely to get cut off, and so would need kind of additional support in preparedness in case people can't get in with supplies and equipment straight after a hurricane. So I think, it's a really critical part of their resilience strategies. The resilience strategy is broadly sort of around being better prepared and reducing risk of impacts of extreme weather events, speeding up recoveries. They're doing a lot of things to improve the recovery time, particularly in critical infrastructure in telecommunications and electricity and supply. And then the third one is more around the sort of longer term economic development and growth trajectory, which is to kind of to think about like which sectors are going to be more resilient to shock. So those are the sort of three pillars of resilience. So preparedness is definitely kind of one of them. And now I've forgotten your other question because I was talking too much. Sorry. So one of the things that's just kind of started now is to develop. There's an organisation that's helping with a resilience scorecard, and they're a kind of group of US philanthropists who have developed this scorecard to help identify what in the kind of resilience strategy could be kind of our kind of bankable investment opportunities. So they're kind of going through now looking at all of the different projects and initiatives that have been identified by Dominica. And so they're looking at things like, particularly like this is kind of a little bit outside of the sort of DRR realm, but like the blue economy, like can there be kind of, could Dominica develop like a blue bond, for example, where like impact investors would come in and to help pay for the kind of protection and restoration of the reef and seagrasses and things which provide that kind of natural buffer to storm surge and coastal damage. So I think that there are small investment opportunities, but you're right. It's much more focused on. It's less focused on adaptation and more focused on mitigation. And sometimes they're kind of the same thing. Like Dominica has geothermal energy, so there's a lot of kind of private sector investment coming in to develop that, which will not only help reduce reliance on imported fossil fuels, but also make the country more resilient as well, because there'll be less need for bringing in energy supply when there is an emergency, right? So that kind of investment opportunity in something which has co-benefits there.
Thank you very much for all those discussions. We touched on quite a lot of very topical and I know points of conversation that could be whole day conferences in themselves. So thank you for giving a spread about your work, about the experience you're doing, or everything, all the work you're doing. So thank you very much, Emily.
Thank
Yeah.
you.